I believe this was meant for someone who actually appreciates the labor behind it. Consider it a mercy, then.
She grabbed the flower right out of his hand without paying, turned on her heel, and walked away like she owned the entire market street. Every vendor nearby went quiet. Every head turned. And the flower seller, dusty coat and all, did not shout after her. He did not chase her. He simply watched her go, with this calm, steady look in his eyes that did not belong on the face of a poor man. That look, that one look, is what started everything. Her name was Beatrice Holm, the third daughter of a struggling merchant family, sharp-tongued and proud in the way that only a woman with very little left to lose can be. She came to Greville Market every Tuesday without fail, not because she loved flowers, but because something about that particular stall made her slow down. Something about the man behind it made her feel, for just a few minutes, like the world was not pressing down so hard on her chest. His name, or the name he gave, was Owen. Just Owen. No family name, no address, no history that anyone in the market could confirm. But here is the thing nobody in that market knew yet. And honestly, nobody was supposed to know. The hands that bundled those flowers every morning were the same hands that once signed documents controlling half the estates in the county. Now, before the story truly begins, think carefully. Why would a man of that kind of power choose a flower stall of all places? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us what beautiful part of the world you are watching from. If this story already has your attention, please subscribe, because what is coming next will completely change how you see him.
Good day, a lovely morning. It is. I hope you are well. Very well, thank you. Take care. You too. Goodbye. Now, to find the ribbons.
Beatrice Holm was not the kind of woman who arrived anywhere quietly. She came into Greville Market that Tuesday morning, with a basket on one arm, a list of errands her mother had pressed into her hand at dawn, and the kind of expression on her face that made street vendors instinctively lower their prices before she even opened her mouth. The market was already alive with noise, the cries of fishmongers, the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestone, the laughter of women gathered around the ribbon stall near the eastern gate. Beatrice moved through all of it like she had somewhere more important to be, which she did not, but no one needed to know that. She was the third daughter of Gerald Holm, a merchant whose business had been slowly bleeding money for 3 years running. The Holm family still kept their townhouse on Fenwick Lane, still wore respectable clothes, still attended church on Sundays with their chins up. But behind closed doors, the tension sat at every meal like an uninvited guest. Her elder sisters, Prudence and Harriet, had both married men of modest but stable means, and the general understanding in the household was that Beatrice would do the same, and soon. Her mother, Agnes Holm, mentioned it no fewer than 4 times a week. Beatrice had her own opinions about that, which she mostly kept to herself. She stopped at the grain stall first, then the linen trader, then the woman who sold dried herbs near the fountain. She was moving quickly, checking items off her list, not looking up more than necessary, when she turned a corner and walked directly into a display of white and yellow field flowers arranged in low wooden buckets on the ground. She caught herself before she fell, grabbed the nearest thing for balance, which happened to be the edge of the flower stall's table, and looked up. The man behind the stall was watching her with an expression that was not alarmed, not irritated, not the usual flustered apology she expected from market vendors when a customer stumbled near their goods. He looked almost amused, in a contained way, like he found the situation interesting but was too composed to show it fully. He was not what she expected. He was tall, which surprised her, because most men who worked market stalls had a slightly folded quality about them, shoulders curved from bending and lifting. This man stood straight. His coat was plain and worn at the elbows, his boots were practical and old, and there was a streak of soil on the back of his left hand from where he had clearly been arranging the flower buckets. But his face, that was the thing. It was calm in a way that felt deliberate, controlled, like he had practiced being unreadable. "You are not hurt," he said. It was not a question. "I am perfectly fine," Beatrice replied, straightening and pulling her basket back onto her arm. "You ought not to leave buckets on the ground where people walk." "The buckets have been in that position every Tuesday for 4 months," he said. "This is the first collision." She opened her mouth, closed it, and then did something she rarely did. She laughed, just briefly, just one short sound. But it was genuine. His name, he told her, was Owen. Just Owen. When she raised an eyebrow at the absence of a family name, he simply said that the flowers did not require one. She bought a small bundle of the yellow field flowers, mostly because she felt she owed him something after nearly destroying his display, and walked away, telling herself she would not think about him again. She thought about him 3 times before she reached the end of the street. The following Tuesday, she came back. She told herself it was because the flowers had lasted longer than the ones from the other stall. That was partially true. The fuller truth was that she wanted to see if the calm was still there, if it was a real thing he carried or just a mood she had caught him in. It was still there. They talked for longer that time. Not about anything of consequence. About the weather, about which of the market vendors were honest, and which ones inflated prices when they spotted unfamiliar faces, about whether the fountain at the center of the market had ever actually worked properly. Owen spoke carefully, and without rushing, which was unusual. Most men, Beatrice knew, either talked too much to fill silence, or too little to avoid effort. Owen seemed to choose each word with a kind of quiet attention that made her listen more carefully than she'd normally would. She noticed things, the way he noticed things, the way his eyes moved across the market with a kind of assessment that was not idle, the way he greeted the elderly spice seller 2 stalls down with a brief nod that the old man returned with what looked almost like deference. Small things, things that did not quite fit together into a clear picture. Over the following 3 weeks, Tuesday became the fixed point of her week. She started arriving a little earlier. She started staying a little longer. Her mother asked why she was taking so long at the market, and Beatrice said the linen trader had been difficult, which was sometimes true. Her friend Constance Bailey, who lived on the next street and had the unfortunate habit of noticing everything, told Beatrice directly that she was looking different on Tuesdays. "Different how?" Beatrice asked. "Like you have decided to be somewhere," Constance said. Beatrice said nothing to that, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. The morning everything shifted was a cold one in late October. A thin frost had settled on the market cobblestones overnight, and the vendors were all wrapped in extra layers, breathing visible clouds into the sharp air. Beatrice arrived to find a small commotion near the flower stall. A young boy, no older than 10, had apparently knocked over one of the wooden buckets in a rush, and the flowers were scattered across the wet ground. The boy was nearly in tears, clearly expecting to be shouted at. Owen was crouched down on the ground, calmly gathering the flowers. He did not raise his voice. He handed the boy one of the undamaged stems and told him to give it to whoever he had been running to see. The boy looked up at him with pure, undisguised relief, grabbed the flower, and ran. Owen stood, brushed off his knee, and looked up to find Beatrice watching him from 3 feet away. "You gave him a flower," she said. "He was frightened," Owen said simply. "Fear is a poor companion for a child." Something in her chest moved. She did not name it. She was not ready to name it. She helped him rearrange the remaining buckets without being asked, and without asking permission. They worked side by side in the cold for a few minutes, not talking very much, and there was something in that shared quiet that felt more honest than most conversations she had with people she had known for years. That evening, she sat at the small writing desk in her room and looked at the yellow flowers in the jar on the windowsill and told herself, quite firmly, that she was being foolish. Owen was a flower seller. She was a merchant's daughter with a family that needed her to make a sensible match. There was no version of this that made sense. There was no path forward. What she was feeling was a soft and impractical thing, and she needed to set it aside before it grew into something she could not manage. She was almost convincing. Almost. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Patrice was in the front parlour, helping her mother sort through a stack of household accounts when the knock came. The family's sole remaining housemaid, a stout and efficient woman named Mrs. Perch, brought in a sealed envelope on a small tray, with the particular expression she reserved for correspondences she considered above the family's current station. It was addressed to Gerald Holm. Patrice's father opened it at the dining table that evening with his reading glasses on and his second cup of tea going cold beside him. He read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and said nothing for a long moment. "What is it?" Agnes asked from across the table. "An invitation," Gerald said slowly, "from the estate of the Duke of Fenmore." The table went still. The Duke of Fenmore was not a name that needed explanation in their county. The Fenmore estate sat 12 miles north of the town, a vast property that most people knew only by sight or by reputation. The current Duke had inherited the title 2 years ago, following the death of his uncle, and had, by all accounts, been largely absent from public life since then. The estate was managed by a steward named Mr. Aldwick, who appeared in town occasionally for business matters, and who had the tight, careful manner of a man who guarded information professionally. The invitation was for a small dinner at Fenmore Hall, 10 days hence, a limited gathering of local families of standing. Gerald Holmes' name had apparently been included, which surprised him visibly. Agnes was not surprised. Agnes immediately began calculating. "This is an opportunity," she said, in a tone that meant the conversation was over before it had properly begun. "Prudence and Harriet are settled. This is for Beatrice." Beatrice looked up from her plate. "I am sitting right here." "Then sit there and listen," Agnes said pleasantly. "A ducal dinner. You will wear your best, you will speak when spoken to, and you will make a favourable impression." Beatrice said she would think about it. Agnes's expression communicated that thinking was not among the available options. 2 days later, Beatrice went to the market. She had told herself she was going for practical reasons. They needed fresh herbs, and the good butcher was only available on Fridays. Both of these things were true. She arrived at Greville Market with her basket and her list, and the full intention of being efficient and purposeful, and not spending any unnecessary time at the flower stall. She walked past it twice before she stopped. Owen was trimming stems at the back of the stall, a small knife moving with practiced ease, and he glanced up when her shadow crossed the table. He said good morning without any particular ceremony, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He never treated her arrival like an event. He treated it like a continuation. "I have been invited to a dinner," she said, without planning to say it at all. He set down the knife. "A significant one?" "At Fenmore Hall." Something moved across his face. It was brief, barely a flicker, and then it was gone, and he was looking at her with the same steady expression he always wore. But she had seen it. She filed it away without understanding it. "You seem uncertain," he said. "My mother is not uncertain," Beatrice said. "That ought to be enough for the both of us." "But it is not," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "No, it is not." He was quiet for a beat. "Why does it trouble you?" Because these events are not really dinners, she said. They are assessments. Everyone sits at the table and looks at everyone else and tries to determine worth. And I find that exhausting. And yet you attend. And yet I attend, she agreed, because my family needs the connection, and because I am not so proud that I cannot do what is required of me. Owen looked at her steadily. You are also not so obedient that you do it without forming your own opinion of the entire arrangement. She laughed despite herself. No, I am not. She left the market 20 minutes later with herbs, a decent cut of meat, and a small bundle of late autumn flowers she had not intended to buy. On the way home, Constance Bailey appeared at the corner of the high street as if she had been waiting, which she probably had. You went to see him again, Constance said. I went to the market, Beatrice said. You came back with flowers. Flowers are sold at markets, Constance. Constance fell into step beside her. She was a small woman with bright, quick eyes, and the kind of loyalty that occasionally tipped into relentless curiosity. Beatrice, I say this with complete affection. You are developing feelings for a man who sells flowers from a wooden bucket. That is a reductive description. Is it an inaccurate one? Beatrice did not answer. Constance took that as an answer. What do you actually know about him? Constance pressed. Where does he come from? Where does he live? Does he have a family? A history? I know how he treats a frightened child, Beatrice said quietly. I know how he listens. I know that when he speaks, he means what he says. Constance was quiet for a moment. Then gently, that is not nothing. No, Beatrice said. It is not nothing. But it is also not enough to build a future on. I know that. She said it firmly. She meant it. But meaning something and feeling something are two entirely separate operations, and she was finding, with increasing discomfort, that her feelings were refusing to consult her reason before making decisions. The dinner at Fenmore Hall arrived before she had adequately prepared herself for it. The Holm family travelled the 12 miles by hired carriage, Agnes fussing over Beatrice's appearance for the entire journey, while Gerald sat quietly and looked out the window. Beatrice kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the countryside give way to the long, torchlit approach of the Fenmore estate. Fenmore Hall was enormous. That was the first word that came to her. Not grand, not beautiful, though it was both. Simply enormous. The kind of house that made you feel the weight of everything it represented, the centuries, the money, the power, the expectation. Lanterns lined the entrance path, and liveried footmen stood at attention on either side of the main door. Inside, the entrance hall was warm and richly furnished. A broad staircase swept upward at the far end. Candles burned in arrangements that caught the gold of every surface. Other guests were already gathered in the drawing room. Sir Reginald Forth and his wife, a pompous man who owned most of the mills in the Eastern District, the Reverend Colbert and his stiff, neat wife, a widowed baroness named Lady Toft, who had the reputation of seeing through everyone, a young lord named Mr. Caspar Dray, recently come into a small inheritance and already trying to grow into the importance of it, and two other families Beatrice vaguely recognized from church. The Duke had not yet appeared. Mr. Aldwick, the steward, moved through the room with quiet authority, ensuring everyone had wine and that no conversation ran too long in one direction. He was watching the door, Beatrice noticed, the way a person watches a door when they are waiting for something important. When the Duke of Fenmore finally entered the drawing room, Beatrice was standing near the window, with a glass she had barely touched. She looked up with everyone else, and the floor dropped out from under her. He was dressed in the formal clothes of a man of rank, everything perfectly fitted, every detail in its correct place. His bearing was composed. His expression was exactly the same, steady, unreadable calm she had been looking at across a wooden flower stall for 2 months. It was Owen. The room was offering their bows and curtsies, and murmuring respectful greetings, and the Duke of Fenmore was receiving each one with the kind of natural ease that only someone born to it could manage. And Beatrice stood completely still by the window, her glass in her hand, the blood gone from her face, unable to move or speak or look away. He turned, in the natural course of greeting his guests, and his eyes found her. He did not flinch. He did not look away. For one long, unbearable second, he simply looked at her. And in that second, she saw the thing she had not been able to name before. Not amusement, not distance. Something far more complicated and far more honest than either of those. Then he moved on to greet the next guest, and Beatrice set her glass down on the windowsill very carefully, because she no longer trusted her hands. Beatrice did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed of the guest room the Fenmore housekeeper had assigned to the Holm family for the overnight stay, staring at the ceiling while the house settled into quiet around her. And she went over every single Tuesday in her mind, every conversation, every silence, every moment she stood at that flower stall and thought she was simply talking to a man who sold things for a living. He knew who she was. From the very first morning, she had walked into his display and grabbed his table for balance. He had known exactly who he was and exactly what he was doing. And he had said nothing. He had stood there, Tuesday after Tuesday, in his worn coat and his old boots, and he had let her believe the most ordinary version of him. The question that sat heaviest on her chest was not why. She could imagine reasons for why. The question was what she was supposed to do now, sitting inside his house, under his roof, a guest at his table, knowing what she knew, and having absolutely no idea what any of it meant. Dinner had been an exercise in controlled agony. She had been seated 4 places down from him, which was both a relief and a torment. Close enough to be aware of every word he spoke to the other guests. Far enough that she was not required to speak to him directly. She had managed conversation with Lady Toft on her left, who was sharp and perceptive, and kept glancing between Beatrice and the Duke with the quiet attention of someone assembling a puzzle. On her right sat Mr. Caspar Dray, who talked about his inheritance with the enthusiasm of a man who had recently discovered he had opinions. The Duke, she had to admit, was remarkable at the table. He was attentive without being performative. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He steered conversations away from discomfort with a skill so practiced it was nearly invisible. He was, in every observable way, exactly what a man of his rank was supposed to be. And underneath all of it, she kept seeing him crouch down on cold cobblestones to gather scattered flowers and hand one to a frightened child. She pressed her hands flat against her quilt and told herself to think clearly. By morning, she had reached one decision. She would speak to him. Not publicly, not dramatically, but directly. She deserved that much. An explanation, or at the very least, an honest conversation without a wooden stall between them and a false name hanging in the air. She came down to breakfast early, before the other guests, intending to request a brief word with the Duke through Mr. Aldwych. What she found instead was the Duke himself, already in the breakfast room, standing at the window with a cup in his hand, looking out at the frost-covered grounds. He turned when she entered, and for the first time since the drawing room, they were alone. "Miss Holm," he said. "Your Grace," she replied. The title felt strange in her mouth. Wrong, somehow, after months of simply thinking of him as Owen. The silence lasted exactly long enough to be uncomfortable. Then she said, "You owe me an explanation." "Yes," he said. "I do." She had expected deflection. She had expected the careful, diplomatic maneuvering she had watched him perform at dinner. The directness caught her off guard, and she disliked how much it softened her. "Then explain," she said. He set his cup down and turned to face her fully. His name, his real name, was Arthur Pemberton, the Duke of Fenmore. He had inherited the title 2 years ago, after the death of his uncle, a man he had genuinely loved, and the weight of the inheritance had arrived at the same time as his grief, which meant he had spent months moving through the estate and its responsibilities, feeling like he was performing a role someone else had written for him. "I needed to understand what people were when they did not know who I was," he said, "when there was nothing to want from me. No title, no estate, no advantage." "So you became a flower seller," she said flatly. "I became a flower seller," he confirmed. "For 3 months, I arranged to have the stall managed quietly. I went on Tuesdays because the market was the busiest, and I could observe the most without attracting attention. And then I walked into your display." Something shifted in his expression. "And then you walked into my display, and told me my buckets were poorly placed." "They were," she said. "They were not," he said. "But I did not correct you that day, because you were already walking away." She looked at him for a long moment. The explanation made a certain kind of sense, which he resented. She resented more that she could feel herself wanting to understand it, wanting to accept it, when the reasonable and self-respecting response was to be furious. "You should have told me," she said, "when it became something more than observation. You should have told me then." He was quiet for a beat. "Yes, I should have." Before she could respond, the breakfast room door opened, and 2 other guests entered, voices already in conversation, and the private moment closed itself like a window in the wind. Beatrice moved to the sideboard and filled a plate she had no appetite for, and the Duke of Fenmore returned to his composed public self, and no one watching them would have known that anything at all had just passed between them. But Lady Toft, who arrived 3 minutes later and poured herself tea at the end of the table, looked at both of them with those quiet, assembling eyes, and smiled into her cup. What Beatrice did not know, as the Holm carriage rolled back down the Fenmore approach road 2 hours later, was that she had been watched by someone else entirely the previous evening. Not with Lady Toft's curious benevolence, with something considerably colder. Her name was Miss Honoria Strayle. She was the daughter of a wealthy landowner from the northern edge of the county, a tall woman of striking appearance and absolute social precision, who had understood from the age of 17 that she would one day be a duchess. Not because she had been promised anything. Because she had decided it. She had cultivated proximity to the Fenmore estate for 2 years, had arranged to be present at every appropriate gathering, had managed the careful, patient work of making herself the obvious choice in the eyes of everyone who mattered. She had not been invited to last night's dinner. She had found out about it anyway, because Honoria Strayle had a network of information that most people would have found unsettling if they had understood its reach. Her lady's maid had a cousin who worked in the Fenmore kitchens, and that cousin had described, over a letter written in haste, the way the Duke's eyes had travelled across the room the previous evening and settled on a merchant's daughter, standing by the window. Honoria read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and set it in the fire. Then she called for her carriage. 3 days after the dinner at Fenmore Hall, a rumour began moving through the social circles of the town. Rumours in that county travelled with the particular efficiency of places where everyone knew everyone else, and information was the primary currency of drawing rooms. This one started quietly, as the most damaging ones always do, and by the time Beatrice heard it second-hand through Constance, it had already made 2 full circuits of the better households. The rumour was this: that Beatrice Holm had been seen behaving with considerable impropriety during the Fenmore dinner, that she had sought out a private meeting with the Duke, that her manner throughout the evening had been forward in a way that reflected poorly on her family's reputation. The details shifted slightly with each retelling, as details do, but the core of it remained consistent. Bertrice Holm was making a play for the Duke of Fenmore, and she was doing it without dignity. Constance delivered this information on Bertrice's front step on a grey Thursday morning, with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing how to say something difficult. Bertrice listened to all of it without interrupting. When Constance finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Someone constructed this." "That is what I think too," Constance said. "It is too specific to be accidental," Bertrice said. "The details about a private meeting. No one saw that except the people who entered the breakfast room afterward, and those were guests who had no reason to speak ill of me." "Unless someone was told about it," Constance said carefully, "by someone with access to the household." Bertrice's jaw tightened. "Who is Honoria Strahl?" Constance's eyes widened slightly. "How do you know that name?" "Lady Toft mentioned her at dinner, in passing. She said something about the northern estates and then stopped herself." Constance was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, Bertrice could see her deciding how much to say. "Honoria Strahl has been positioning herself for the Duke of Fenmore for 2 years. She is wealthy, well-connected, and by all accounts she does not accept interference graciously." "And you didn't think to tell me this before," Bertrice said. "Before last week, I didn't think you needed to know," Constance said. "You were talking to a flower seller, Bertrice. I didn't imagine it would reach this. The rumor was only the beginning." 2 days later, Bertrice received a note. It was unsigned, written in a neat and educated hand, and it invited her to a brief meeting at the old reading room above the bookshop on Crane Street. The note said that the writer had information concerning the Duke of Fenmore that Bertrice would find relevant to her situation, and that the meeting would be to her advantage. Any sensible woman would have ignored it. Bertrice told Constance about it instead, and made Constance come with her. The woman waiting in the reading room above the bookshop was not Honoria Strahle. She was a small, anxious woman of about 30, with ink-stained fingers and the careful posture of someone who worked for a living. She introduced herself as Miss Tully, and she was, she explained quickly, a correspondence secretary who had until recently worked for a solicitor's firm that handled certain affairs for the Strahl family. She had left that position. She was leaving the county. But before she went, she had something she felt she ought to say. Honoria Strahl, Miss Tully said, had arranged for a letter to be sent to Gerald Holmes' primary creditor. A letter containing specific information about the full extent of the Holm family's debts, information that had been obtained through channels that were not clean, and that was framed in a way designed to accelerate the creditor's decision to call in the debt immediately, rather than wait. If the creditor acted on the letter, the Holm family would be required to settle their accounts within 30 days. They did not have 30 days' worth of funds available. Bertrice sat very still across from Miss Tully and felt the room change temperature. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I was asked to help draft that letter," Miss Tully said, "and I did not. But I also did not stop it, and I have been unable to sleep since." She pressed her hands together on the table. "I am telling you because you deserve the chance to do something before it arrives." Bertrice and Constance walked out of the bookshop into the cold street and stood on the pavement for a moment without speaking. "She is going to ruin your family," Constance said quietly. "She is trying to remove me," Bertrice said. "If my family is in a public financial crisis, I become an embarrassment. Any connection to the Duke becomes impossible. Any whisper of a match becomes ridiculous." She pulled her coat tighter. "She is not just spreading rumors. She is building a cage." "Then you need to warn your father," Constance said. "I need to do more than that," Beatrice said. She went home, told her father nothing yet, and sat at her writing desk for an hour. Then she did something that cost her considerably in terms of pride. She wrote a letter. She addressed it to Fenmore Hall, marked it for the Duke's personal attention, and she wrote clearly and without embellishment about what Miss Tully had told her. She was not writing to ask for rescue. She was specific about that. She was writing because if someone was using his name and her proximity to him as a weapon against her family, then he deserved to know it. She sent it with the afternoon post, and then went downstairs and helped her mother with the household accounts, as though nothing at all was happening. The reply came the following morning. Not a letter. A visitor. Mr. Aldwych arrived at the Holm townhouse on Fenwick Lane at precisely 10 o'clock in the Fenmore carriage, with the particular composure of a man carrying instructions he intended to carry out exactly. He was shown into the front parlour, where Beatrice sat with her mother, who had gone immediately rigid with the specific alertness of a woman who recognised a significant carriage. Mr. Aldwych delivered his message with precision. The Duke of Fenmore was aware of the situation described in Miss Holm's correspondence. He was already in possession of some information pertaining to certain parties and their activities. He wished to assure Miss Holm that the matter concerning the letter to her father's creditor would be addressed, and that she was not to be alarmed. Agnes Holm made a very small sound that she covered with a cough. Mr. Aldwych added, as a secondary point, and with the faintest elevation of his chin, that the Duke would be grateful if Miss Holm would be willing to receive a brief visit from him the following afternoon, if her schedule permitted. Agnes's hand landed on Beatrice's arm before Mr. Aldwych had finished the sentence. Beatrice said, in a level voice, that her schedule permitted. After Mr. Aldwych left, Agnes turned to her daughter with the expression of a woman whose calculations had just rearranged themselves entirely. She said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Beatrice looked at her mother. She thought about Tuesdays. She thought about yellow flowers in a jar on the windowsill. She thought about a man crouching on frost-covered cobblestones, handing a stem to a frightened child, and saying that fear was a poor companion for a child. "It is a long story," she said. "I have nowhere else to be," Agnes replied. Outside, on Fenwick Lane, a light rain had begun to fall, and 12 miles north, in the study of Fenmore Hall, Arthur Pemberton sat at his desk and read Beatrice's letter for the 3rd time, and made 2 decisions. The first concerned Honoria Strayle and the letter she had sent to Gerald Holmes' creditor. The second was more personal, and considerably harder to act on, and he sat with it for a long time before he folded the letter, placed it in the top drawer of his desk, and went to find Mr. Aldwych. Arthur Pemberton arrived at Fenwick Lane the following afternoon in a plain carriage. Not the Fenmore carriage with its crested doors and liveried driver. A plain one. Beatrice noticed this from the upstairs window before she came down, and the choice told her something about him that she filed carefully away. He was still thinking about how things felt to other people. He was still, in some part of himself, the man who wore an old coat and stood behind a wooden stall. Agnes had arranged the front parlour with the particular precision of a woman who understood that appearances were a form of argument. The good cushions were out. The fire was properly built. Tea things were arranged on the side table with a neatness that communicated respectability without desperation, which was a delicate balance Agnes Holm had spent years perfecting. Gerald Holm sat in the armchair nearest the window, with the expression of a man who had spent the previous evening being told a great deal of surprising information and was still quietly processing it. He had not said much since Beatrice's full account the night before. He had listened, asked 2 careful questions, and then gone to bed early, which for Gerald was the equivalent of a significant emotional response. Arthur was shown in by Mrs. Perch, who managed to communicate enormous curiosity through the complete blankness of her expression. He greeted Gerald with the kind of straightforward respect that did not perform itself, shook the man's hand, spoke to Agnes briefly and warmly, and then turned to Beatrice. "Miss Holm," he said. "Your Grace," she said. They sat. Agnes poured tea. For approximately 4 minutes, the conversation was entirely appropriate and entirely surface level, and Beatrice could feel her mother exerting extraordinary restraint in not steering things faster than propriety allowed. Then Gerald set his cup down and said, in the direct manner of a man who had been a merchant long enough to dislike wasted time, "I understand you have dealt with the matter concerning my creditor." "I have," Arthur said. "The letter that was sent to Mr. Crewe was intercepted before he acted on it. I have spoken with Mr. Crewe personally. He is a reasonable man, and the situation has been explained to him. Your accounts will not be called in." Gerald nodded slowly. "I am in your debt." "You are not," Arthur said. "What was done to your family was done as a means of applying pressure in a direction that had nothing to do with you. The fault belongs entirely elsewhere, and the correction was simply the right thing to do." Agnes made the small sound again. This time she did not bother covering it. Beatrice looked at Arthur across the tea table. He was composed, as always, but there was something underneath it today that was different from the composure she had watched at Fenmore Hall. Less performed, more effortful, like he was holding something steady that wanted to move. "You came in a plain carriage," she said. Agnes stiffened slightly. Gerald glanced at his daughter. Arthur looked at her steadily. "Yes." "Why?" she said. The room was very quiet. "Because I didn't want the first honest conversation we have had in a proper setting to begin with the wrong impression," he said. "The carriage with the crest announces something before I open my mouth. I didn't want that announcement to be the first thing." Gerald looked at his daughter. Agnes looked at her husband. Something passed between them that was too fast and too private for Beatrice to read. She kept her eyes on Arthur. "You were dishonest for 2 months." "I was," he said. "And I told you in the breakfast room that I should have corrected that sooner than I did. I meant it then. I mean it now." "What changed?" she asked. "What was the moment you knew it had gone past observation?" He was quiet for 3 full seconds. "The morning with the child and the scattered flowers. I watched you help rearrange those buckets without being asked, and without wanting anything for it. And I understood that I had stopped observing weeks before that, and had not admitted it to myself." The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, the rain that had started the previous day was still falling softly against the parlour window. Beatrice looked at the man across from her, and understood with complete clarity that she was standing at the edge of something that could not be approached cautiously. It was the kind of thing you either stepped toward or you stepped back from, and the choice had to be made from honest ground. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not a woman who can be managed. I am not a woman who will smile at dinners and remain quiet about things that matter. If you are sitting in this parlour because the title requires an appropriate match, then I am the wrong choice, and we are wasting each other's time." Agnes closed her eyes briefly. Gerald made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Arthur looked at Beatrice with an expression that was not composed at all. It was something much more unguarded than that, and it lasted only a moment before he brought it back under control. But she saw it, and it was, without any question, the most honest thing she had ever seen on a human face. "I am sitting in this parlour," he said carefully, "because I spent 2 months watching a woman argue with fish vendors, give exact and accurate opinions on the price of linen, help a stranger arrange flowers in the cold, and carry the weight of a struggling household on her back without once asking anyone to notice. I am not here about the title. The title does not require anything from me today. I am here because I made a mistake in not being honest sooner, and I would like, if you are willing, to begin again from an honest place. The parlour was so quiet that the rain on the window was the loudest thing in the room. Then Gerald Holm picked up his teacup and said, to no one in particular, "Well, that seems plain enough." Agnes opened her eyes and reached for the teapot with the energy of a woman who had just decided that everything was going to be managed excellently. What none of them knew yet, sitting in that warm parlour with the rain outside and the fire built properly, was that Honoria Strehler had not finished. She had learned about the intercepted letter within 24 hours of it being stopped. Her source inside the Fenmore household, a footman named Briggs, who had been in her family's employ before being placed at the estate, had sent word immediately. Honoria had sat with this information in the cold drawing-room of Strahl Park, in the house her father had built at the cost of everything he had, and she had felt something move through her that was not grief and was not anger, but was the specific and clarifying feeling of a person who has decided that ordinary methods are no longer sufficient. She called for her cousin, Mr. Piers Strehler, who was 26 years old, deeply in debt to Honoria personally, and willing to do most things she asked if she worded them correctly. She also sent for a woman named Mrs. Good, who was not good in any recognizable sense of the word, but who had a particular skill for finding information that people believed was safely buried. Her plan was simple, and it was vicious. If she could not remove Beatrice through social ruin or financial pressure, she would remove her through the Duke himself. She would find something in Arthur Pemberton's past, something real or something that could be made to appear real, and she would place it in front of Beatrice in a way that made the entire foundation of his honesty collapse. She had 3 days before the next social gathering of consequence, a public assembly at the town hall that most of the county's notable families attended. 3 days was enough. She had worked faster before. Mrs. Good arrived at Strahl Park that same evening with a leather satchel and no particular expression. They sat together for 2 hours in the cold drawing-room, and by the end of it, Honoria had a direction, a method, and the particular stillness of someone who has decided to stop being patient. What Honoria didn't know was that Lady Toft had been watching her for considerably longer than she had been watching Beatrice. Lady Toft was 71 years old, had been widowed twice, had survived 3 decades of county society, and had developed over that time a finely calibrated instinct for the specific kind of damage that certain women could do when they felt cornered. She had recognized Honoria Strehler at 17 as precisely that kind of woman. She had been keeping a quiet and informal account ever since. The morning after Arthur's visit to Fenwick Lane, Lady Toft wrote 2 letters, one to Mr. Aldwick at Fenmore Hall, one to a magistrate in the next county who owed her a considerable favour, and who she described only as a useful friend. Then she put on her coat and went out into the rain to call on Beatrice Holm. Lady Toft arrived at Fenwick Lane without advance notice, which Agnes found alarming, and which Beatrice found oddly reassuring. She was shown into the parlour, and declined tea with the brisk efficiency of a woman who did not intend to stay long. She sat, looked at Beatrice directly, and said, "I am going to tell you several things, and I need you to listen without interrupting until I have finished." Beatrice said she would try. Lady Toft told her about Honoria Strehler in the way that someone tells a story they have been carrying for a long time. She described the 2 years of careful positioning, the network of informants, the letter to the creditor, and the meeting at Strahl Park with Mrs. Good that her own source had reported to her within hours. She described what she believed Honoria was now attempting, which was to find or fabricate a piece of information damaging enough to destroy whatever was forming between Beatrice and the Duke before the public assembly at the end of the week. When Lady Toft finished, Beatrice said, "What do you need me to do?" Lady Toft looked at her with something that was close to approval. "Nothing reckless. I need you to attend the assembly. I need you to behave exactly as you normally would. And I need you to trust that the people working on your behalf are doing so effectively." "What people?" Beatrice said. "Mr. Aldwych is not simply a steward," Lady Toft said. "He has been managing the Duke's interests, including the less visible ones, for 11 years. He knows exactly what Mrs. Good is, and he knows her methods. He has already taken steps." She paused. "I have also written to a magistrate who will be attending the assembly, and who is prepared to act if necessary." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "You have been building this for some time." "I have been watching Honoria Strel for 14 years, Lady Toft said simply. "I have been waiting for her to go far enough that something could be done about it properly." She looked at Beatrice with those clear, steady eyes. "You, my dear, appear to be the thing that finally made her go far enough." After Lady Toft left, Beatrice sat alone in the parlour for 10 minutes. Then she went upstairs, stood at the window where the yellow flowers had once sat in their jar, and thought about everything she hadn't chosen, and everything she had, and the very thin line between the two. The town assembly was held on a Friday evening in the main hall of the civic building, a large, well-lit space that the county used for gatherings of exactly this kind. Candles in the high brackets, long tables along the walls, the measured noise of 150 people in their better clothes trying to enjoy themselves while also watching everyone else carefully. Beatrice arrived with her parents and Constance, who had refused to be excluded, and who had spent the carriage ride providing a detailed tactical analysis of the room layout that Beatrice had not asked for, but found genuinely useful. Arthur was already present, standing with Mr. Aldwych near the far wall, talking with Sir Reginald Forth, and a man Beatrice did not recognise, in a dark coat, who had the specific posture of someone with official authority. The magistrate, she understood. Honoria Strel arrived 20 minutes after Beatrice, with her cousin Piers at her elbow, and the expression of a woman who had prepared thoroughly and was confident in her preparation. She was striking in the way that certain dangerous things are striking, immediately visible, immediately commanding, the kind of presence that rooms adjusted to accommodate. She moved through the gathering with complete control, greeting people, pausing at the right moments, saying the right things, building toward something Beatrice could feel, gathering in the room like pressure before weather. Piers Strahler, Beatrice noticed, was carrying a document case. Constance leaned close. "That case," she said quietly. "I see it," Beatrice said. Honoria made her way, in the measured and inevitable way of someone executing a plan, toward the centre of the room, where the gathering was densest, and where any public disclosure would carry the furthest. Piers moved with her. The document case changed hands briefly, and Beatrice saw Honoria's fingers close around something inside it. She was going to produce something. Publicly. In front of everyone. What happened next moved quickly. Mr. Aldwych appeared at Honoria's left, smoothly, as though he had simply been passing through, and spoke to her in a voice too low to carry. Honoria's expression did not change, but her movement stopped. Piers looked sideways at his cousin, with the expression of a man who had just registered that something had gone wrong. The magistrate, the man in the dark coat, had moved to a position just behind Piers. Not aggressively, simply there. Honoria looked across the room, and her eyes found Arthur Pemberton. He was watching her with the composed, level expression that Beatrice had come to understand was not distance, but precision. He was not angry. He was not performing. He was simply completely clear about what was happening and completely prepared for it. Then his eyes moved from Honoria to Beatrice, and in that moment, in the noise and candlelight of a crowded civic hall, something passed between them that was entirely private and entirely unhurried, as though the room and everyone in it had agreed to wait. Honoria looked at Beatrice too, finally, directly, and Beatrice met her gaze without moving or looking away. She had spent enough of her life being assessed by people who thought they could determine her worth from a distance. She was finished accommodating that particular exercise. What Mrs. Good had produced for Honoria turned out to be a letter, supposedly written by Arthur's late uncle, suggesting financial irregularity in the transfer of the Fenmore title. It was, Mr. Aldwych had determined, 48 hours before the assembly. A forgery. An extremely competent one, but a forgery nonetheless. The handwriting had been copied from genuine correspondence. The dates had been carefully chosen, but 2 details were wrong, details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the estate's actual records would catch, and Mr. Aldwych had caught both of them before the document left Mrs. Good's possession. Mrs. Good, presented with this information by Mr. Aldwych that same morning, had made the practical decision to provide a full account of her commission in exchange for certain considerations. The magistrate at the assembly had that account in his coat pocket. Piers Strahl, understanding rapidly that his cousin's plan had collapsed entirely, and that he was standing next to a magistrate holding a document case containing a forged letter, made the decision to sit down at the nearest table and say nothing. It was, in fact, the most sensible thing he had done in several years. Honoria stood in the center of the room for a long, still moment. Then she handed the letter back to Mr. Aldwych with a composure that Beatrice found, despite everything, almost impressive. She said something brief and quiet to Piers. She did not look at Arthur again, and she did not look at Beatrice again. She moved toward the door with the particular posture of someone who is not running, but is moving in a direction with great finality. She left the county 3 days later. The circumstances of her departure were managed quietly, which was, Lady Toft said afterward, a greater mercy than she had earned. The assembly continued. Conversations resumed. The musicians at the far end of the hall started their next piece, and couples moved toward the floor. Agnes Holm found herself in a long and apparently comfortable conversation with Lady Toft that she would describe for months afterward as one of the most instructive evenings of her life. Gerald Holm accepted a glass of something from a passing tray and breathed out for what felt like the first time in weeks. Constance found a corner with a good view of the entire room and stayed there happily. Arthur crossed the hall toward Beatrice. She watched him come and did not pretend she was not watching him. There was no point in pretending anything anymore. They were well past the particular performance of indifference, and she found, to her own slight surprise, that she did not miss it. He stopped a proper distance from her, because they were in a public room with 150 people, and he was still, underneath everything, a man who understood that certain things required the right setting and the right time. But he looked at her with the full, unguarded expression she had seen in the parlor, the one that cost him something to show, and he said quietly, "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly all right," she said. "You are certain." "I argued with your flower display on a cold Tuesday morning and have been navigating the consequences ever since," she said. "I think I have demonstrated a reasonable capacity for managing difficulty." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "When this is over, I would like to have a proper conversation with your father." Her heart did something she declined to describe in detail, even to herself. "About what?" she said, because she wanted to hear him say it. "About what comes next," he said, "if you are willing." She thought about the first Tuesday, The cold cobblestones, the scattered flowers. A man she had thought she understood, and had not understood at all, and had come to understand more honestly than she had understood almost anyone. "I am willing," she said. Outside the civic hall, the night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that made everything sharp and exact. Stars were visible above the town rooftops. The carriages waited in a patient row along the street. Inside, the music continued, and the candles burned, and 150 people went on with their evening, most of them entirely unaware that anything of consequence had just concluded in their presence. Agnes Holm, who was aware, smiled into her conversation with Lady Toft and said nothing about it at all, which was its own kind of dignity. And somewhere in the town, in a small house behind the market, the flower stall's wooden buckets stood in a corner, waiting for a Tuesday that would not come again, which was, perhaps, exactly how it was supposed to be. Some things are only ever meant to be a beginning, and the best beginnings, the ones that actually hold, are built on the honest ground of who you really are, when nobody is watching and nothing is required of you except the simple, difficult act of being true. That is where this story began. On a cold market morning, between a wooden stall and a woman who did not stop to look, and then could not stop looking. And that is where it ends. Not with noise or ceremony or a room full of witnesses, but with two people choosing, clearly and without performance, to begin. Now, before you go, think about this. The moment Beatrice first saw Arthur at Fenmore Hall and recognized him as Owen, she had every reason to walk away and never look back, but she did not. She asked for the truth instead. Was that courage, or was it something else? And when Arthur chose the plain carriage over the crested one for that first proper visit, what did that tell you about who he actually was beneath the title? Drop your answers in the comments below, because these are the details that reveal everything about a person's character. And I genuinely want to know what you think. I will be going through every single comment and responding, so do not be shy. Also, where in this beautiful world are you watching from? Tell me your city, your country, your corner of the earth. Because this story traveled to reach you, and that means something. If this story moved you, held you, or kept you up a little later than you planned, please subscribe and share it with someone who loves a good love story told the right way. There is so much more where this came from, and you do not want to miss what comes next.